Is the microphone working in the back here okay? Hey, Michael. How are you? Here's me. Hey, I don't know if you noticed when Alyssa was doing the introductions, but she introduced herself as our new plant pathologist, and we're very fortunate to have Alyssa. Started about a month ago as our pathologist. Going to work. Her office is down at Georgetown at the Research and Education Center, so you're going to see a lot of her, and we're very fortunate to have her on our staff. I'm going to talk about cover crops for weed control and weed suppression, and then talk about how weed management overall impacts some of our cover crop decisions and management of it. If you've got questions as we go through here or something's not clear, I don't mind if you just shout out questions or ask for clarification instead of waiting to the end. Sometimes that helps to make sure that we get your questions answered. A lot of the work that we've done on cover crops in the last few years has been collaborative work. With my group here in Delaware, with Barb and Quentin, and more recently with Kurt Vollmer. A lot of it's been collaborative work that's also been done with Penn State, with Bill Curran, John Wallace, and Jess Bunchek, and then with Stephen Mirsky and Matt Ryan. And this year we also have a number of projects going on with Virginia Tech, with Michael Flesner as well. So it's important that we do a lot of this work at multiple sites. When we're looking at cover crops, particularly for weed suppression, environment and management has a huge impact on it. And while 2 or 3 really well-designed studies or locations are very valuable, multiple sites are even more valuable and more powerful. So being able to collaborate with this group of weed scientists in the region really, I think, is helping us zero in a little bit more on this cover crop. And I think as we do more work in this cover crop arena for weed control, and we answer some of the pressing questions, we are opening ourselves up for about 10 times as many more projects that we need to look at. It's kind of like the house of cards. You change one thing and something else shifts. And from a research standpoint, it's exciting. It's very interesting. From an extension standpoint, to stand up and say, this is how you need to do it, if there's a lot more, well, it depends type of answers and stuff. So it's challenging from that standpoint, exciting from the opportunities that it gives. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some background on cover crops, talk a little bit about the intersection of cover crops and weed control or weed management and weed suppression, and then talk about some of the agronomic practices for weed control and how that might impact cover crops. I think sometimes living here, traveling up and down the eastern shore and across the bay, we see cover crops and we kind of lose sight of the fact that we're planting and using cover crops in this region to a much greater extent than a lot of other parts of the United States. I was reading one of these newsletter that I get subscribed to, and I think the editor of it is in Indiana, and it's a no-till newsletter. And he was talking about how he came down here to Ocean City, flew into Baltimore, drove down to Ocean City for a meeting he was at, and he was just amazed at the amount of cover crops that are planted along that he saw along the trip. And it's something that we just take for granted, but we are in a unique situation. It gives us an opportunity, both from a production standpoint as well as extension, to kind of look at this on a much larger scale and try to zero in on what is the best management of cover crops for our intended purposes. You know, if you look at the list of cover crops or list of benefits of cover crops, you can see it's basically a laundry list. And there's a lot of things that a cover crop can do for you if it's managed for that objective. And I think that's something that we often lose sight of. We talk about cover crops, number one, without specifying what species we're talking about, and without talking about why are we planting it. Well, you know, a lot of folks are planting it for nutrient management, all right, but there's other benefits. And so what is it that you're trying to maximize that cover crop for? And a lot of our work in the last few years has been looking at cover crops for weed suppression. You know, and the main reason for that is because of the spread of herbicide-resistant weeds in the area. We have been battling the glyphosate-resistant horseweed for a number of years now. For almost as long, we've been working with herbicide-resistant common ragweed. I think it was 2001 or 2002 when we first identified common ragweed that was resistant to ALS herbicides and PPO herbicides in Sussex County. That kind of faded away when Roundup Ready came out and was really widely used. But now we've got populations of common ragweed on the eastern shore and southern Maryland, and possibly Virginia, Michael? And Virginia, that's resistant to three classes of herbicides: glyphosate, ALS herbicides, and PPO herbicides. So in soybeans, you're really limited on what options you've got for controlling that common ragweed. And then, of course, you know, you can't talk about a weed management topic these days without mentioning Palmer amaranth. So it's not just Palmer amaranth, it's a big wide range of species that we have to deal with. And we're not getting any new tools from the chemical side to help us with resistance management. What we're using in grain crops as far as a mechanism of action, meaning how that herbicide actually kills the plant, the most recent product we have was registered in 1986. So we're not seeing new products coming on the market, and I know basic manufacturers are looking for new mechanisms of action, but there isn't anything that we're going to see in the near future. Yet we're still putting a lot of pressure on the chemicals we've got, putting more and more selection pressure on, so we've got to make sure that they remain viable as long as we can. And some of these non-chemical tactics are what we really need to focus on. And since cover crops are so widely used in this area, it's something that many of our growers are familiar with. How can we manage that cover crop to help with weed management? The other thing to keep in mind as we talk about cover crops and weed management is making sure that we understand the life cycles of some of the weeds. A lot of the talk and a lot of the presentations and research on cover crops for weed suppression focus on summer annual weeds, pigweeds, lance quarter, ragweed, and so on. But what we often forget about is that those cover crops can really help us with some of our winter annual weeds as well. Things like chickweed and henbit, you know, some of those species that under normal no-till scenarios will flower and produce viable seed before our burn-down herbicides are used. So we're not doing a lot to stop seed production or limit seed production of those winter annual weeds in our traditional no-till scenarios. By having a cover crop planted out there starting in the fall all the way, you know, into the spring, we're at least suppressing the growth of those winter annual weeds and not getting as much buildup in the weed seed bank. Also note, you know, we're looking at some of these winter annual weeds when we're also talking about resistance. So we've also looked at, you know, these winter annual weeds are also resistant species, like resistant chickweed, Italian ryegrass, and horseweed and mare's tail. You know, a lot of fields for cover crops are often terminated in late March, early April, before that cover crop really has a chance to produce a lot of biomass. Mostly what we're talking about and a lot of the work that we've been doing is looking at developing more biomass of that cover crop to have a bigger impact on weed suppression. And one way of doing that is delaying that termination later and later into the spring. You know, cover crops, as I mentioned, they have multiple functions. They, you know, you can, they have many different purposes depending on the species and the management. But one management strategy, one cover crop species does not fit all the potential objectives that you might be planting a cover crop for. For instance, you know, looking at cover crop for weed control. You know, if we're looking at maximizing weed control or weed suppression here, you know, along with that, we'll probably get higher organic matter production. We'll probably get some nitrogen or nutrient retention as well. It will help with erosion control, but we may be sacrificing nitrogen fixation by doing so. We might be using more of our soil moisture prior to planting because that cover crop's growing later. So there are trade-offs when we're using cover crops and for specific objectives. In general, our cereals, whether that be cereal rye, wheat, triticale, you know, they tend to be the best for both winter annual and summer annual weed suppression. Reason for that is they produce a lot of biomass, and depending on when it's terminated, that tissue can be pretty resistant to breakdown, or it breaks down slower than some of the biomass associated with the legumes. You know, the legumes are generally slow growing in the fall, so they don't compete very well with winter annual weeds. They have a lot of fleshy leaves and stems that break down very rapidly, or break down more rapidly in the summer than the grasses. And so they tend to be poor competitors with winter annuals and don't provide as long of a residual benefit as the grain crops do. Now, as I mentioned, there's trade-offs with cover crops depending on what your objective. You know, looking at that cover crop for weed control, you know, versus what it might be for nitrogen fertility. So if we're looking at nitrogen fixation, we're using primarily a legume. So that legume is going to may not give us as good of weed suppression. It's going to impact and probably give better crop productivity because of the nitrogen. But you can see that a lot of the strengths of these arrows change depending on what our objective is. And that really comes down to the species that we're planting and how we're managing that cover crop. So, you know, when the conversation starts around cover crops, it's important to know what is your objective with that cover crop, and then based on that objective, what's the species you're using and how are you managing it. You know, cover crops for weed suppression, the cover crops are going to, and management of cover crop impact weed management. You know, usually with our winter annuals and our early spring emerging summer annuals, it's straight crop competition, plant-to-plant competition. You know, limited resources, the more competitive plant is going to win out over the less competitive plant. You know, they're basically competing for resources needed for growth. What are the requirements that most plants need to grow? Nutrients, water, light. The fourth one. No, temperature. Temperature impacts it, but doesn't necessarily. This is the one, you know, where you bet. Okay, what's the four things that plants need to grow? Nitrogen or nutrients, water, carbon dioxide. Yeah, no one gets that. Unless you have a child that's in 6th or 8th grade biology class and they get hammered over the head. It's like, oh yeah, I knew that. But anyways, so it's competition, and lot of times it's light competition. Primarily it's light competition. These cover crops, particularly our cereal rye or our cereals, get taller, they get larger, taller than the winter annuals, and they just outcompete it for light. When we terminate that cover crop, and in many cases we're using a chemical spray to terminate that cover crop, that spray is also getting down and into the canopy and killing any of the emerged weeds that might be present. So early in the year it's competition. At termination time it's probably chemical. And then once that cover crop is dead, it's providing a physical suppression. And that physical suppression, again, is primarily limiting light that's getting to the soil surface and to those seedlings. So, as I mentioned, thinking about the benefits of cover crop based on the life cycles of the weeds, it's having a big impact, or can have an impact if we choose the right cover crop species and manage it, for our winter annual weeds like henbit and dead nettle and chickweed and so on. This is looking at some of the work that we did a few years ago, looking at rye at different seeding rates on horseweed or mare's tail density. So we planted rye in the fall. We planted it at half a bushel or 33 kilograms per hectare, 1 bushel, and 2 bushels of rye in the fall. And then came back about June 1 and did weed counts of horseweed. And, in 2003 at this particular site, we saw a nice stepwise reduction in the number of horseweed plants per meter, with increasing our seeding rate, reduced the density. Not always worked out nicely in that sort of stepwise, but at least in 4 of the 5 cases here, we saw a significant reduction in the horseweed density where we used cereal rye. Of course, there's always the outlier here. In 2005, at this particular site, we saw little, if any, benefit to seeding the rye. Well, at this particular site, our rye never got more than 30 inches tall. It was poor soil. It just did not grow. So we just didn't get that competition. So, it's keeping in mind that to get these benefits of the cover crop, it's making sure that cover crop is managed properly. So it's not an absolute, but we can see some pretty dramatic reductions in densities where we use a cover crop of our winter annuals. This is also looking at a study. This is looking at cereal rye, where we planted cereal rye at 2 bushels in the fall, and then came back and terminated it 6 weeks before planting soybeans, 4 weeks before planting soybeans, or 2 weeks before planting soybeans. And we counted the number of weeds present at the time that the cover crop, the rye, was terminated. So we had no rye versus 2 bushels. So we had no rye 6 weeks before planting. We saw a nice reduction in the density of our winter annual weeds. Even more dramatic when that cover crop termination was delayed till 4 weeks or 2 weeks before planting. And primarily that was because we had a lot of late emergence of winter annuals where we had no rye cover crop. But what we're seeing here is a nice reduction in the density of our winter annuals due to the presence of the cover crop. Now kind of switching now and talking about some of our summer annual weed work. Things like large crabgrass, common ragweed, lamb's quarter. After that cover crop is terminated, again, a lot of that deals with physical suppression from the cover crop on small seedlings or emergence. When we started this work a number of years ago, it was kind of the idea is the more the better. The more biomass you have, the better control you're going to get. I think that's something that we're starting to look at and reevaluate. How much biomass do we really need? And what is the trade-off maybe of less biomass with better in terms of weed control as well. Also looking at later, more mature tissue. The longer that cereal rye, the wheat is allowed to grow, the more lignin that's produced, the more resistant it is to breakdown when it's on the soil surface. As I mentioned with the legumes, those leaves decay quite quickly. It's the stems, those kind of woody, fibrous stems that we're looking for long-term, as long of suppression as we can get. Also keep in mind that a lot of these properties that we're looking at for suppression, from the physical suppression, they can also impact the emergence of the crop. Generally, we don't see, in most cases, we're able to overcome any issues with that, particularly since a lot of the grain crops we're planting are large seeded. They've got a lot of carbohydrates reserved, and they come through that mulch pretty well. But it is something that we need to be aware of. So we're looking at mature lignified tissue that's going to help impact the duration of weed suppression once that cover crop is terminated. And some of the things that are going to impact that tissue is understanding what our planting methods are, our planting dates, our seeding rate, possibly the genetics that we're using. A lot of times right now we're looking at using variety, not stated cover crops, but there's a lot more work done recently on some of the different varieties and actually breeding cover crops for different benefits. So, in the future we may not be, we may be talking about varieties of cover crops as well as what the species is. We like to think about what is the benefit of our cover crop and be able to measure it. Is more always the better? And you think back of benefits of the cover crop. Is it linear? If just the more cover crop we have, the more benefits we're going to have. Is that the case? It would be nice. It'd be a heck of a lot easier to predict and work with this. But in reality, it's it's much more complicated. It's it usually comes out, the benefits are seen as more of a logistic curve or sigmoid curve, where at very low levels we may see little of any benefit, and then we get a rapid increase in benefits, and then we get to a point where we start to see some diminishing returns. And what we're trying to do is understand this part of the curve in terms of benefits, of where are we getting the biggest bang for our buck. One of the things that we're looking at, or we want to be mindful of, is decomposition of that cover crop once it's on the soil surface. This is some work that they did over at USDA Beltsville. They planted straight rye, straight vetch, or did a 50-50 mix of rye and vetch. And then they terminated it, rolled it, and it remained on the soil surface, and they went back periodically and measured how much biomass was still there. So at time zero, or right as it was terminated and rolled, they've got 100% of the biomass is still remaining. And then as time went out, they dropped. The the dots here are rye, the solid line is the pure vetch, and the dashed line is a 50-50 mixture. So to lose about 50% of the biomass of the hairy vetch, it occurred at about 55 days after termination. So after about 55 days, half of that biomass is gone. Compare that to the cereal rye, the pure rye. Well, it was about 175 days till half of that rye was gone. Then with the 50-50 mix, while it was a little bit longer than the hairy vetch by itself, it still was only about 80 days after termination that 50% of it was gone. So again, it kind of illustrates the benefits that we're getting out of the cereal rye or the grain crops in terms of that lignin tissue that's resistant to decay. And how much biomass is necessary? That's always kind of the big question. You know, that's going to impact maybe what our seeding rate is, what type of field conditions we're going into in terms maybe of residual fertilizer, residual nitrogen that might be out there, but how much biomass do we really need? Well, this is some work that was done a number of years ago with USDA Beltsville with Chuck Moeller and John Teasdale. And they were looking at the number of seedlings based on the amount of rye that was out on the soil surface. And so the number of different weed species there. And for most of these species, looking at a noticeable reduction in the number of plants per area, when you're in that area of about 4,000 to 6,000 pounds per acre of biomass. You know, with lamb's quarter, it seems to be a little bit more sensitive to it than maybe velvet leaf. But in general, 4,000 to 6,000 pounds was doing an appreciable amount of reduction in density. And we find with a lot of our work, you know, 5,000 pounds is not unusual for us to produce 5,000 pounds of cereal rye. So it's an area that we need a lot more work on of what is this range that we should be looking at, and how do we get it? And are there any detriments to going well beyond that 5,000 pounds? You know, you can't give a weed talk anymore without talking about Palmer amaranth. So, you know, that was not the case in 1993. They didn't have Palmer amaranth densities enough that they had to worry about. But I kind of joke it's going to be nice one of these days when we give a talk and not have to talk about Palmer amaranth. I'm not sure when that's going to be. Maybe by the time Michael's career is over, he'll get to that point. But so our Palmer amaranth, this is some work that was done in Tennessee, looking at Palmer amaranth emergence. And again, that 4,000 to 6,000 pounds per acre is giving them about a 50% reduction in Palmer amaranth density. So yes, we can get additional densities or additional reduction with higher biomass, but you know, with that roughly 5,000 pounds per acre, we're getting a noticeable reduction in the number of Palmer amaranth plants. This is also from Tennessee, where they are looking at Palmer amaranth control 6 weeks after planting with different levels of cover crop biomass. Now this is overall control, so it not only takes into account weed density, but weed growth as well. And again, looking at about 5,000 pounds, you can see there's you know, well over 60 to 70% reduction in, or 60 to 70% control of Palmer amaranth. Maybe not as high of a level control as we need to have, but by itself, it's really contributing a lot to Palmer amaranth control. This is again the trial that we're looking at here in this region, where we're looking at rye planted at 2 bushels in the fall, and then terminated 6 weeks before planting soybeans, 4 weeks before planting soybeans, and 2 weeks before planting soybeans. We're looking at the number of summer annual weeds in this case. Where we had no rye and where we terminated that rye 6 weeks before planting, really no difference in the number of summer annual weeds that emerged throughout the summer. Yet, if we delayed that termination till 4 weeks or 2 weeks before planting, we saw a tremendous reduction in the number of weeds that emerged throughout the summer in this case. So, you know, this going in with 6 weeks before planting, we're terminating it before that rye has a lot of biomass, and we're terminating it well before planting. That gives a long period of time for weed emergence to occur. So delaying that termination gives us closer to planting, more biomass, more suppressive ability on our weeds. This is also from the Tennessee group. How many of you know the name Milton Berle? What was his old saying? Goes, I know a good joke when I steal one. Yeah, I know good data when I take it from somebody. So it's not always what you generate; it's what you're able to get out there. But anyways, this is looking at cover crops and looking at legumes as well as cereal cover crops, and then they planted cotton and then measured the Palmer amaranth on a daily basis till it got to 4 inches tall. And how long did it take to get to 4 inches in height? So in this case, where they had no rye or no cover crop at all, it took about 15 days from planting till it got to 4 inches tall. Where they had the legumes, and remember, their legume biomass was not particularly heavy. It was only about 2,000 pounds. But it only gave them an additional 2 to 3 days of suppression of the Palmer amaranth before it got to that 4-inch height. But if you look at the wheat and the cereal rye, 27 to 28 days after planting before it was to that 4-inch height. So the cover crops are not only helping us by reducing the density, but it's also reducing that early season growth. You have a question?
Just wondering, was there statistical difference between the no cover and the area mesh or the crimson? Were they statistically significant?
So I don't believe there was difference between the legume species, but there was the wheat and the rye was significantly different than the legumes.
What about the cover, the no cover, and the...
That I'm not sure of. I should have put that on the chart. I didn't think of it.
You're going to steal it. You
You got
got to steal it all.
to steal it all. That's right. That's right. So looking at getting that biomass, getting the biomass that's going to help us with weed suppression. We talk a lot about, we hear people talk about planting early so we can get that biomass that we need. This is some slides taken from up at State College where they planted cereal rye starting at August 25th up to August 15th at about 10-day increments. And these photographs were taken on April 1st. So you can see there's a noticeable difference in the amount of biomass and ground cover with these August 25th, September 5th, September 15th. Start to see some differences here between the 25th of September and the first week of October. And from October 5th to October 15th, tremendous reduction in the amount of ground cover that they're getting there. So you can see why we often talk about getting it planted early. But there's a flip side to that as well. Not only that, those photographs were taken on April 1st, but if you have later planting dates, you can compensate for a lot of times with later termination dates. So I know this is a busy slide, so let's kind of dissect this a little bit. This is that May 1st termination date, and where we delayed the, again, we're seeing more biomass with that earlier planting date when it's terminated on May 1st. But if we delay that termination till May 30th, again, we see a reduction in biomass as we delay our planting, but our overall biomass is significantly higher by delaying that termination by 3 weeks, or 4 weeks. So a common thread, regardless of when we terminate, we tend to have more biomass with our earlier planting date, but later termination dates as well. So if we look at this top bar, delaying our planting date from September 5th to October 15th, September 15th to October 15th, we reduced the amount of biomass by about 2,000 pounds. However, if we don't plant till October 15th, but delay our termination date by 4 weeks in the spring, we've increased the amount of biomass by 6,000 pounds. So those later termination dates are giving us a tremendous difference in biomass production. This slide is always confusing because it's done chronologically from left to right, but really we're looking at biomass going from right to left. So August 25th planting date, September 15th, and so on, all terminated on May 1. The amount of biomass that's produced and the effect that that biomass had on lamb's quarter density. So that's August 15th, August 25th, we're just over 5 plants per meter square. But if we delay that termination, delay our planting date to October 15th, then it's terminated on May 1. We don't have nearly as much biomass produced, and not as big of an impact on weed density. Also, to kind of take this one step further as well on biomass production and growth, the situation in which we're planting our cover crop is important. This is a project we did also with Penn State, where we planted spring oats with forage radish, so these were winter killed, cereal rye, and cereal rye plus the forage radish. And what we wanted to do was mimic a site that had low nitrogen levels or some residual nitrogen. So we spread some nitrogen out in the in the fall at planting. And we're looking at percent ground cover from the different cover crops. And in both years, we're seeing an increase in the amount of ground cover where we had some residual nitrogen available. So the growth of that cover crop, planting date's important, seeding rate's important, but so is the residual nitrogen. And this is just kind of visually looking at that. This is a cereal rye with no nitrogen or low nitrogen, and cereal rye where we had that 60 pounds. And notice the amount of ground cover that we had there. With the other thing, kind of notice here, we got rye, we have oats. Notice how much better ground cover we're getting with rye than we are with oats. Oats tend to be a more upright growth habit. You can compensate for that maybe by using like the tillage or the forage radish in between to help give us a little bit better ground cover there. All right, so we see that cover crops, particularly the cereals, are giving us reducing the density of our weeds, and they're slowing the growth, and so that when we do go in with either our herbicide or chemical or a mechanical weed control, the weeds are smaller and more susceptible. Some of the other considerations as it relates to weeds and herbicides and cover crops is the potential for herbicide carryover to getting our cover crops established. Much like observing our herbicide rotations for herbicides when we're planting vegetables or maybe small grains, the same issues come up with planting cover crops. Carryover can be impacted by soil texture, soil pH, organic matter, and rainfall and temperature. So anything that's going to enhance the degradation of that herbicide is going to reduce the length of time that it's biologically active in the soil. And not all cover crops respond differently to the same herbicides. This is from the University of Missouri, where they have the forage radish with a number of different soybean herbicides. Looking at the non-treated check and cobra, which has little to no residual activity, see no difference there. But notice anything that has fomosafen in it. Fomosafen is the active ingredient in Reflex as well as in Flexstar. We have fomosafen in the prefix, and in both cases, severely injuring our forage radish. Pursuit, a lot of injury there with pursuit. However, similar chemistry in this first rate, we're not seeing as much injury with first rate. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done in this type of area of understanding herbicide carryover when we're planting our cover crops. Because we're often looking at different intervals than we're often dealing with grain crops. For instance, using corn pre-emergence herbicide in April or May, you're not planting soybeans to the 12 months later. But you're planting your cover crop. Your corn maybe get harvested in September, planting your cover crop immediately after that. That's a much shorter window, and trying to understand that. To make things even more challenging in this area where there's a push to planting cover crops sooner and sooner, even using something like the air seeder in August, or work being done in Penn State about interseeding. Now we're planting our cover crops 2 to 3 months after that herbicide application was made, and what's the potential risk? A lot of what you're seeing in terms of herbicide carryover are studies that are done planting the cover crops after crop harvest. In our scenarios here where we might be trying to push that earlier planting date, keep that in mind, that what that interval is between application and planting cover crops. What is the best seeding method for the cover crop? How uniform does that cover crop need to be in order to provide the expected weed suppression? That's something we don't really have a good handle on yet. We see differences in weed suppression based on levels of cover crop biomass. If you have thin stands due to poor seeding, poor seed to soil contact, what is going to be the impact that might have on weed suppression? That's something that we need to have a better handle on and be able to talk and give better advice on how to manage that. Termination is important. It makes a big difference if you're terminating in March versus May. Yes, the cover crop is a lot smaller, so we'd think it'd be easier to kill. But March 1 is not ideal growing conditions either. May, early May, sunshine, we finally maybe getting some warm temperatures. A much taller cover crop sometimes can be easier to kill if we're with a May application than small cover crop in March. So environment has a big impact on that. Some of the things that we have to consider when we're thinking about terminating our cover crop is the stage and where the size of it. It's particularly important if we're looking at mechanical termination of the cover crop and maybe an organic situation where we're using the roller crimper. We've got to that roller crimper is much more effective when the cover crop is at the reproductive stage. If you're dealing with mixed stands, making sure that the cover crop species that you're using flower at a similar time so that you can maximize the effectiveness of that roller crimper. Keep in mind, as we delay these, potentially delay our termination later and later, what's the potential for that cover crop to produce a seed, and is that an issue? It depends on what you're growing. Annual ryegrass in a wheat rotation that grows to seed might be a problem. Hairy vetch or mustards, again in small grains, if they're allowed to produce seeds, may be an issue that you have to deal with in the small grain crop. So be aware of that. Soil moisture, these cover crops with delayed termination are taking up an awful lot of moisture. They can dry out the soil very, very quickly. Pay attention to the weather. You may really want to terminate that cover crop on May 1, but if it hasn't rained for 2 weeks and there's no rain in sight, you may want to terminate it a little bit earlier, or wait till you get a good shower to replenish that soil before you terminate it. And then, making sure that you're matching up your herbicides with the cover crop species that you have, and be aware of what plant back restrictions you might have. When are you going to terminate that cover crop? Is it going to have enough biomass there to provide some weed suppression, or are you going to need to follow it up with a later application at planting? All right. One of the questions we get a lot, how many people have planted into some late terminated cover crop? All right. Do you roll or do you plant with the cover crop standing? Roll? Who says roll? Who says keep it standing? Who says I'm not sure? I don't know. It's like it's a less filling, tastes great debate. It's one of our projects that we're looking at is what is the best time to should you roll it? Should you knock it down? One of the things that we find too with terminating it and knocking it down, a lot of that depends on the planter you have. So one of the things we've seen a lot is where you might have a planter with two toolbars with your 15-inch units offset, don't seem to knock down the rye, as well as a situation like this where you've got all your units on a single toolbar. It's got a nice straight effect on it. When we run this through, we're often seeing as good of knockdown as if we did a roller crimper. We're also doing some more work with planting green this year, seeing where that leads us as far as weed control, as what are the benefits, and what are the maybe potential trade-offs with other issues with planting green. So that's something that we're looking at as well. So, one of the things that we find challenging in our area and from a recommendation standpoint is fitting a legume into our rotation as far as a cover crop and managing that legume for weed suppression. A lot of times that legume would go in after soybeans. That's very late, unless those soybeans come off early. That's pretty late in the year. How can we get that legume established and get enough growth to help us with weed suppression? How can we reduce our herbicide inputs? We're seeing a reduction in weed density. We're seeing a reduction in growth of our weeds due to cover crops. What does that mean in terms of our herbicide inputs? How can we back off from our herbicide inputs and maybe save some costs there? That's something that we're looking at as well. So I'll leave it at that. We have time for a couple questions, comments. Yes. How would I define planting green? I think of planting before the cover crop is terminated, and then terminating the cover crop after planting. Most of our work has been we'll plant and then come back and spray glyphosate. Usually it's rye, so we're planting soybeans into rye, and then 2 to 3 days after planting the soybeans, spraying glyphosate and killing the rye.
It seems like some of the add-ons are sort of pushing, like rolling the rye green, and then do they use a chemical afterwards with it in a laid-over state?
So yes. A lot of times they are. They might be laying it over, planting through it, and then coming back, a few days later with glyphosate and killing that rye. In terms of like termination of rye, particularly with soybeans, what we have found is you either want to spray it about 10 days before planting so that when you plant that rye is dead, or you want to plant it green and then spray it later. Trying to plant into a cover crop as it's dying doesn't work very well at all. Either dead or growing healthy, those are the two choices there. But if they're planting green, most times they're coming back in with a glyphosate application after planting. And what we've been doing most of our work with is 2 to 3 days. I know other areas they're stretching that out, maybe even 7 to 10 days after they plant and spraying their glyphosate. And there are questions, comments?